This terrorist movement ignores borders and has the ambition to build a state. That is the threat. It is global, so there must be a global answer.
Telle est la menace. Elle est globale. Il doit donc y avoir une réponse globale.
Welcome back to The World from Below. I'm Lizzie O'Shea, and that was a clip of French President Francois Hollande outlining the need for a global response to the situation in Iraq and Syria. Our guest tonight is international relations expert Dr Scott Burchill about the conflict in Iraq and Syria and the nature of the Islamic State. The response of the United States and by association Australia to the Islamic State has been almost exclusively military by nature. Scott, is it or was it possible to find a diplomatic solution to the current conflict?
Well, the first problem is that they decided to restrict the nature of the military response before it even began by saying they wouldn't be putting boots on the ground. Now, if there'll be boots on the ground, the question is whose feet will be in those boots. And it looks like it could be Kurds, it could be Iraqis, but it doesn't look like it's going to be an effective fighting force. These guys are really tough. So how will it end diplomatically? Well, remember, the Iraq War went for 8 years, I think. The war in Afghanistan, in many ways, is still going on. It began in November 2001. So there's no obvious way in which diplomacy can take over here, particularly because the West will not want a humiliating retreat yet again from the Middle East. And ISIS is not the kind of organisation that appears to be interested in compromises or, reaching some sort of agreement with the West, because this whole conflict began as a sectarian struggle within Syria and Iraq, and by internationalising it, the West has introduced more complex dimensions to it, which mean that it will continue even beyond the initial origins of the conflict, which were localized to Syria and Iraq. So now we've got this situation of how do you get a diplomatic solution when the whole problem has been escalated by one side, which is the West.
We talked a bit about how the campaign conducted by the United States and Australia as well, it will advantage Assad militarily, but there are also difficulties in trying to negotiate with allies of opponents of Assad too. I'm just wondering what your thoughts were. There was a big call that the United States should have intervened in Syria militarily years ago, whether in your view that would have changed the dynamic that we see today.
Well, remember the famous red lines argument that Obama used, and then he had to be bailed out by President Putin in Russia to get rid of the chemical weapons that the Assad regime had in storage and had presumably been using. But the Americans were reluctant to get involved then for the same reason that they've declined to put boots on the ground now, and that is Obama wanted to be a president who withdrew from wars, not someone who began them, and he knows that he can conduct a bombing campaign which will be relatively risk-free to American troops, but it won't give him the decisive victory in the short term or even the medium term. So whether he had intervened earlier in Syria, I think begs the question of what would American troops on the ground then have done, because they would have not only been confronting regular Syrian forces, who are a formidable fighting force, but presumably also the common enemy of all other Iraqis and Syrians fighting who weren't necessarily against Assad and introducing a completely new dynamic again. So hard to see how that would have helped. It probably just would have escalated it earlier than it did already.
One of the controversies that's cropped up already in respect of Australia's involvement has been that Australia is providing arms directly to a Peshmerga, a Kurdish fighting force in the north of Iraq, rather than through the central Iraq government. That might seem ironic to many observers of Middle Eastern politics, particularly given that the PKK, or the Kurdish Workers' Party, is actually a prescribed terrorist organisation under Australian law. So there's all sorts of offences associated with providing arms and money to the PKK, and Australia can't guarantee that the arms that it provides to the Peshmerga will not fall into the hands of the PKK. What do you make of the Kurdish involvement in the forces fighting ISIS, and what are the implications for the region?
Well, they're interesting because the priority for Kurds is creating a state of Kurdistan, which the West also opposes, and which Turkey in particular is strongly opposed to. Since the occupation of Iraq in 2003, the Turks have been very concerned that northern Iraq would form the basis of a new state of Kurdistan, which would also take in Turkish territory. But there's a couple of things we can say. One is, take no notice of what the Iraqi government is saying. It basically does what the Americans tell it to. It's a fig leaf of an independent authority, and the paperwork may have to be done through Baghdad, but that's about all. As far as the Kurdish dynamic is concerned, the PKK are a more decisive and successful militant organisation against ISIL than the Peshmerga that we are funding. And in fact, the Peshmerga have conceded this and have a history of handing on their weapons to the PKK because they're seen as a more effective fighting force. So when Julie Bishop, the Foreign Minister, said we can't guarantee that those arms won't leak to the PKK, that's a euphemism for saying they absolutely will, and they'll be handed over by the Peshmerga when the PKK need them. Remember, the PKK and the Peshmerga are allies in the same cause, and the creation of a state of Kurdistan is a much higher priority than fighting a Western enemy in Iraq and Syria.
I mean, Turkey's obviously opposed to an independent Kurdish state, and there's some controversy on the border right now with ISIS or the Islamic State getting very close to the border, but also that border has been a place through which many resources can flow through to forces fighting on behalf of the Islamic State. How far do you think it's going to get before Turkey starts to play its hand, I suppose, in respect of an independent Kurdish state and, where they fall on the side of ISIS or elsewhere?
Well, they've improved their relations with the Kurds in recent years. So the government in Ankara hasn't been as hostile to Kurds in the last 2 years under Erdogan as they had previously. But as you say, they're extremely opposed to any creation of a Kurdistan state that will take in Turkish territory. But the priority for Erdogan in Ankara is the defeat of Assad in Damascus. So he's much more interested in that than he is in fighting ISIL. And that's why the Turks have been extremely reluctant to join the Western coalition against ISIL, in particular because the Americans were hoping the Turks might do some of the ground fighting. Well, they will if that border is directly threatened, but ISIL's not stupid and they're not going to want to take on another front. And providing they stay on their side of the border, I suspect that the Turks will, they will protect that border, but they won't bite into a fight that they're not really haven't really got a stake in. And this is already being discussed in Washington, where the Americans have been saying how frustrated they are that Turkey will not get involved. There's a lot of investment and hope in that.
And we're going to take a short break, but we'll be back to talk further about Islamophobia and the consequences arising from the war on the Islamic State.